This is insane, isn't it? Liam's voice, a low rumble against the thrumming bass of the Viper Room, barely reached Eleanor's ear. Her own laugh, a brittle, almost forgotten sound, was swallowed by the crowd. He was 23, all lean muscle and restless energy, a stark contrast to her 42 years, which felt heavy and worn tonight, despite the carefully applied makeup. They stood too close for strangers, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a spark of forbidden static arcing between them and the suffocating heat of the club. Eleanor had come here on a dare from a colleague, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, beyond the dull ache of a life half-lived. Liam, she suspected, was just looking for trouble, or perhaps, for a distraction from a future he hadn't quite figured out. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear, smelling faintly of whiskey and something sweet, like mint. "Are you even supposed to be here?" he teased, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, dancing with an insolence that both irritated and thrilled her. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck. It wasn't just the age gap, though that loomed large and obvious. It was the raw, unpolished intensity he exuded, a stark reminder of the wildness she had long since buried under layers of corporate decorum and maternal responsibility. She found herself smiling, a genuine curve of her lips that felt unfamiliar. "And what makes you think I'm not?" she shot back, her voice huskier than she intended. The challenge was out there, unspoken but palpable, a dangerous game beginning to unfold in the dimly lit chaos. Their conversation, if it could even be called that amidst the deafening music, was a series of shouted questions and close-whispered answers, a fragile bridge built between two worlds. Liam spoke of his band, a struggling indie rock outfit playing dive bars, and his dreams of escaping his small-town past. Eleanor, carefully, selectively, spoke of her work as an architect, omitting the soul-crushing meetings and the bitter taste of a failing marriage. He made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in what felt like decades. It was a dizzying, disorienting sensation, like stepping onto solid ground after years of treading water. A slow song, something soulful and bluesy, began to play, and without a word, Liam took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a shockingly firm grip. His touch was electric, not just because of its unexpectedness, but because it bypassed all her carefully constructed defenses. It was a silent invitation, a dare she found herself aching to accept. As they danced, or rather, swayed together in the tightly packed space, Eleanor became acutely aware of their perceived incongruity. Heads turned, she was certain of it, though she dared not meet anyone's gaze. The whispers, she imagined, were already forming, sharp and judgmental. Look at her, old enough to be his mother. The thought sent a jolt of shame through her, but it was quickly eclipsed by a surge of defiant pleasure. For once, she didn't care. For once, the opinions of strangers, of anyone, felt utterly insignificant compared to the intoxicating novelty of Liam's presence. He spun her gently, his arms circling her waist, pulling her closer until her head rested against his chest. She could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat, a primal rhythm that resonated deep within her. It was then, in that stolen moment, surrounded by strangers and bathed in the intoxicating glow of reckless abandon, that Eleanor felt a crack in the icy facade she had maintained for so long. A tiny, fragile crack, but a crack nonetheless. He pulled back, his hand still lingering at her waist, his eyes searching hers in the gloom. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he murmured, his voice laced with an earnestness that disarmed her completely. It wasn't a line, she realized, but a genuine expression of curiosity. Eleanor, who had grown accustomed to being invisible, to being taken for granted, felt a warmth spread through her chest, a thawing sensation she hadn't known she craved. She found herself reaching up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, a gesture so uncharacteristic, so reckless, that it astonished even herself. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, then something else, something deeper, passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of the precipice they were teetering on. And then, he smiled. Not the cocky, playful grin he had worn all night, but a genuine, unburdened smile that transformed his face, erasing the youthful bravado and revealing a vulnerability she hadn't expected. It was a smile that promised secrets, whispered confessions, and a dangerous, exhilarating leap into the unknown. And in that smile, Eleanor felt a flicker of something long dormant within her, a tiny spark of hope, a whisper of a forgotten joy. It was the first time she had truly smiled in years, a real, unforced smile that reached her eyes, and the sheer unexpectedness of it made her breath catch in her throat. The next morning, the intoxicating haze of the club had been replaced by the stark, unforgiving light of day. Eleanor sat at her kitchen counter, a lukewarm coffee cooling beside her, the memory of Liam's touch a vivid, almost painful echo on her skin. She scrolled through her phone. A text from him: "Had a great time last night. Let's do it again soon." Staring back at her, a physical manifestation of the reckless decision she had made. Guilt, sharp and acrid, twisted in her gut. Her husband, Mark, was still asleep, his side of the bed cold and undisturbed, a silent testament to the chasm that had long existed between them. Their marriage was a meticulously constructed facade, a monument to shared history and convenience, devoid of passion, sustained by habit. Liam, with his youthful fire and unburdened laughter, threatened to shatter it all. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that pursuing this was playing with fire, not just for herself, but for her 2 children, who deserved more than the wreckage of their parents' choices. Later that week, a casual coffee with her closest friend, Sarah, felt less like a friendly chat and more like an interrogation. Sarah, with her keen observations and unwavering loyalty, had always been able to read Eleanor like an open book. "You're glowing," Sarah said, stirring her latte, her eyes narrowed with a speculative glint. "And don't even try to deny it." "What's his name?" Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. The suddenness of the question, the piercing accuracy of it, left her momentarily speechless. She stammered, offering a vague explanation about a successful project at work, but the words felt hollow, even to her own ears. Sarah simply raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. "Eleanor, we've known each other for 20 years. I can tell when you've discovered something new and exciting. Spill." The pressure mounted, the weight of her secret almost suffocating. She managed to divert the conversation, skillfully weaving in details about Sarah's recent vacation, but the close call left her rattled, a stark reminder of the fragile nature of her deception. The following Saturday, Eleanor found herself parked down the street from the small, run-down venue where Liam's band was playing. She felt a ridiculous surge of nerves, like a teenager on a first date. She spotted him through the grime-covered window, setting up equipment on stage, his hair falling into his eyes as he hunched over a guitar. He looked utterly at home, immersed in his element, a stark contrast to her own carefully curated, orderly existence. A sudden, unexpected pang of longing shot through her. This was his world, vibrant and raw, and she was an outsider, a tourist glimpsing a life she had long since abandoned. As she watched him, lost in thought, a familiar black Mercedes pulled up behind her. Her stomach dropped. It was Mark's car. He was supposed to be at his golf club, an alibi as solid and predictable as their marriage. Panic seized her. She ducked down, hoping the tinted windows of her SUV would offer some concealment, her breath catching in her throat as she waited for him to pass. He drove on, thankfully, without seeming to notice her, but the near miss left her trembling, a chilling premonition of the unraveling that lay ahead. Liam called her the next day, his voice a warm balm against the lingering anxiety from the previous night. He thanked her for coming, said he'd seen her car, and asked if she wanted to grab dinner. Eleanor, still reeling from almost being discovered, felt a desperate need for caution. "I can't," she said, her voice strained. "I have plans." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. There was a beat of silence on the other end, a palpable sense of disappointment. "Right," he said, his tone flat, the easy camaraderie of their previous interactions suddenly absent. "Of course. Busy architect." The sarcasm was thinly veiled, a direct hit to her carefully constructed persona. Eleanor felt a sharp pang of regret. She wanted to explain, to tell him about the complexities of her life, the invisible chains that bound her, but the words felt too heavy, too revealing. "It's not like that," she began, but he cut her off, a sigh escaping his lips. "Look, Eleanor, if you're not interested, just say so. Don't string me along." The accusation stung. She was interested, more than interested, but the cost felt impossibly high. The phone clicked as he hung up, leaving her with the echoing silence and a profound sense of loneliness. Days bled into a week, then 2, and the silence from Liam grew heavier with each passing day. Eleanor found herself restless, irritable, snapping at her children and retreating further into herself. The carefully constructed piece of her life felt hollow, brittle. One evening, after putting the children to bed, she sat in the dim light of the living room, a half-read book forgotten in her lap. The phone rang, startling her. It was an unknown number. Her heart leaped, a foolish, hopeful flutter, quickly followed by a wave of apprehension. She answered, her voice tentative. A woman's voice, cold and precise, cut through the silence. "Is this Eleanor Vance?" The name was pronounced with an unsettling emphasis, a subtle shift in tone that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "Yes, it is," Eleanor replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is this?" There was a brief pause, a deliberate, agonizing silence that stretched taut with unspoken threat. Then, the woman spoke again, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "I know about you and Liam." The words hung in the air, a poisoned arrow finding its mark. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The phone felt like a block of ice in her trembling hand. The carefully constructed walls of her secret life had just been breached, and she had no idea who had fired the first shot, or what wreckage would follow in its wake. The chilling phone call reverberated in Eleanor's mind, a constant, unsettling hum beneath the surface of her everyday life. She tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a prank or a misguided assumption, but the woman's voice, cold and assured, had lodged itself deep within her. Who knew? How much did they know? The questions gnawed at her, turning every casual glance into a suspicious stare, every whispered conversation into a potential threat. Her carefully constructed world, once so solid and predictable, now felt like a house of cards, trembling on the verge of collapse. The thought of Liam, and the reckless, exhilarating nights they had shared before her sudden retreat, felt both like a distant dream and an imminent danger. She knew she shouldn't seek him out, that every instinct for self-preservation screamed for her to sever all ties, but the magnetic pull of their connection, the raw, untamed passion he ignited within her, was a force she found increasingly difficult to resist. One rain-soaked Tuesday, unable to bear the suffocating silence any longer, Eleanor drove to Liam's apartment. The building was old, a brick edifice with peeling paint, a stark contrast to her manicured suburban home. She found him in the dimly lit practice space in the basement, hunched over his guitar, a half-empty beer bottle beside him. He looked up as she entered, his eyes, usually so vibrant, clouded with a weary resignation. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of her sudden withdrawal and the lingering sting of his disappointment. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, the words feeling fragile in the cavernous room. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous tightrope they were walking. "I know," he replied, his voice rough, devoid of its usual playful lilt. The raw honesty of his response, the lack of accusation, disarmed her completely. She moved towards him, drawn by an invisible current, and without a word, he set down his guitar and pulled her into an embrace. His arms tightened around her, a desperate, anchoring grip that felt like coming home. That night, cocooned in the comforting darkness of his small apartment, the outside world with its threats and expectations faded into an irrelevant hum. They talked for hours, the kind of intimate, searching conversation that stripped away layers of pretense and revealed the raw, vulnerable core beneath. Eleanor confessed the crushing weight of her marriage, the quiet desperation that had settled over her life, the feeling of being trapped in a meticulously planned future that wasn't truly hers. Liam, in turn, spoke of his own insecurities, the fear of never living up to his potential, the constant struggle to find his place in a world that felt indifferent to his art. They found solace in each other's vulnerabilities, a shared understanding that transcended their age difference and their disparate lives. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, filtering through the blinds, Eleanor realized she hadn't felt this alive, this truly seen, in years. She traced the line of his jaw, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and a quiet, profound sense of intimacy settled over them. This was more than just physical attraction, it was a deep, soul-stirring connection that felt both terrifying and undeniably right. Leaving his apartment felt like tearing herself away from a vital part of herself. She drove home through the waking city, the early morning commuters oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred within her. The world looked different, imbued with a new vibrancy, a dangerous promise. As she pulled into her driveway, the familiar facade of her house seemed to mock her, a symbol of the double life she was now leading. She slipped inside, moving with a practiced stealth, her senses heightened, every creak of the floorboards a potential betrayer. Her children were still asleep, their innocent faces a stark reminder of the consequences of her actions. Mark was gone, an early golf game, she presumed, a small mercy. She breathed a sigh of relief, the immediate danger averted, but the precariousness of her situation pressed in on her. The anonymous phone call, the constant threat of exposure, hung heavy in the air. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered exchanges, a clandestine dance between two people caught in a web of deceit. They met in obscure cafes, in the shadowed corners of parks, their conversations laced with a thrilling urgency, a desperate hunger to absorb every detail of each other's lives. Each meeting felt like a daring escape, a temporary reprieve from the suffocating demands of their separate worlds. One afternoon, as they sat in a quiet booth in a diner on the outskirts of the city, Liam confessed a long-held secret, a painful betrayal by a former bandmate that had left him with a deep-seated mistrust. As he spoke, his voice raw with emotion, Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a silent gesture of comfort and understanding. In that moment, the barriers between them dissolved entirely, leaving behind only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. As they left the diner, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street, Eleanor felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She laughed at something Liam said, a genuine, uninhibited sound that surprised even herself. As they walked towards her car, hand in hand, lost in their own world, a flash of light caught her eye. It was quick, almost imperceptible, from a parked car across the street. A glint of chrome, a subtle movement behind tinted glass, and then, a distinct click. Her heart seized. It was too fast to be a reflection, too deliberate to be a coincidence. A chilling realization washed over her. Someone had just taken their picture. The anonymous phone call, the lingering threat, suddenly coalesced into a terrifying reality. They had been watched, followed, and now, they had been caught. The warmth of Liam's hand in hers suddenly felt like a branding iron, marking them, exposing them to a world that would not understand, a world that would judge. The laughter died in her throat, replaced by a cold knot of dread. The hidden witness, a silent predator, had finally revealed its presence, and the precarious world they had built together was about to come crashing down. The photograph, grainy but unmistakably them, arrived in an unmarked envelope at Eleanor's office a week later. It was a single, devastating image, her hand intertwined with Liam's, their faces tilted towards each other, caught in a moment of unguarded intimacy as they left the diner. The sight of it sent a cold dread through her, a visceral punch to the gut. The casual observer might see a harmless moment between friends, but to anyone who knew her life, it was a damning piece of evidence, a silent scream of betrayal. The anonymity of the sender only heightened her terror. Who was behind this? Was it Mark, driven by suspicion and anger? Or someone else, a disgruntled colleague, a busybody neighbor, meticulously compiling a case against her? The secrecy she had so desperately clung to was shattered, exposed in the cruel light of that single photograph. She couldn't bring herself to call Liam immediately. The implications of the photo, the magnitude of the exposure, felt too overwhelming to articulate. Instead, she retreated into herself, a silent, internal struggle waging within her. The guilt, once a dull ache, sharpened into a searing pain. Her children's innocent faces flashed before her eyes, and the thought of causing them pain, of disrupting their stable lives, felt like a betrayal far worse than anything she had done to Mark. But then, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. Why should she be the only one to bear the burden of this secret, this shame? Why should she sacrifice her newfound happiness, her rediscovered sense of self, to protect a decaying facade? The moral dilemma tore at her, pulling her in opposing directions, each path fraught with its own set of consequences. That evening, Mark arrived home earlier than usual, his demeanor stiff, his eyes avoiding hers. He held a glass of whiskey, nursing it slowly, the silence in the room heavy with unspoken tension. Eleanor's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She knew, instinctively, that this was it. He didn't need to say anything, the air around him crackled with a cold fury that spoke volumes. "We need to talk, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He placed a single, folded piece of paper on the coffee table between them. It was the photograph, his hands trembling slightly as he laid it down. Eleanor stared at it, her gaze fixed on the image, a silent admission of her transgression. The carefully constructed lies, the whispered excuses, dissolved into nothingness. There was no denying it, no explaining it away. "So, this is him," Mark continued, his voice barely a whisper, but laced with a cutting bitterness. "The reason you've been so distant lately." His eyes, when they finally met hers, were filled with a raw, wounded anger that pierced her to the core. Eleanor felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with an overwhelming wave of regret. The secret was out, the suffocating burden lifted, but the cost was immense. "Mark," she began, her voice hoarse, "it's not what you think." Even as she spoke the words, she knew how hollow they sounded, how cliché. There was no denying the truth of the image. He scoffed, a humorless sound that twisted her stomach. "Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think. My wife, with a boy half her age." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. They argued for hours, the polite facade of their marriage crumbling under the weight of years of unspoken resentment and recent betrayal. Mark brought up every perceived slight, every distant look, every moment she had been emotionally absent. Eleanor, in turn, unleashed her own pent-up frustrations, the slow suffocation of a life lived by someone else's expectations, the quiet desperation that had driven her into Liam's arms. The children, thankfully, were asleep, shielded from the brutal honesty that now filled their home. At one point, in a fit of rage, Mark threatened to expose her, to ruin her career, to fight for full custody. The words, flung like poisoned darts, momentarily stunned her into silence. The thought of losing her children, of being publicly shamed, filled her with a terror so profound it eclipsed even her love for Liam. The moral dilemma returned with a vengeance, amplified by the raw, emotional fallout of their confrontation. The next day, a major architectural conference was scheduled, an event Eleanor had spent months preparing for. It was a high-profile gathering, attended by industry leaders and media, and she was slated to deliver the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was expected to project an image of professional success and unwavering integrity, while her personal life was spiraling into chaos. She considered calling in sick, feigning an illness, but her pride, and a stubborn refusal to let Mark win, propelled her forward. As she stood on the brightly lit stage, the spotlight hot on her face, a sea of expectant faces gazing up at her, she felt an unsettling calm descend. She began her speech, her voice clear and resonant, projecting an air of confidence she didn't feel. She spoke of innovative design, of pushing boundaries, of creating structures that reflected the future. Suddenly, a ripple went through the crowd. Murmurs erupted, hushed whispers that quickly grew louder, more agitated. Eleanor paused, her eyes scanning the room, a cold knot forming in her stomach. At the back, near the main entrance, stood a woman, her face stern, her gaze fixed directly on Eleanor. It was the woman from the phone call. And beside her, holding a large, blown-up print of the photograph, was a younger man, his face grim, his eyes burning with an unreadable emotion. Liam's ex-girlfriend. The realization hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't Mark's doing, it was something far more vengeful, far more public. The image, held aloft for all to see, instantly silenced the room, replacing the gentle hum of conversation with a shocked, horrified gasp. All eyes, now, were on her, on the damning proof of her transgression, illuminated by the harsh glare of the conference lights. The truth, raw and undeniable, was exposed, not in a private confrontation, but on a grand, public stage, for the entire world to witness. Eleanor stood frozen, the words of her speech dying on her lips, her carefully constructed life crumbling around her in a spectacular, public implosion. The aftermath of the conference was a brutal, relentless onslaught. The public exposure, swift and merciless, ripped through Eleanor's life with the force of a hurricane. The whispers turned into shouts, the stares into open condemnation. Her name, once synonymous with professional success, was now plastered across tabloids and gossip sites, entwined with sensational headlines about scandal and betrayal. The architectural firm, fearing irreparable damage to its reputation, swiftly put her on indefinite leave, a thinly veiled dismissal. Her carefully cultivated career, built over 2 decades of relentless effort, crumbled into dust. But the professional fallout, as devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the personal wreckage. The children, her innocent children, were now caught in the crossfire, their school days marred by hushed conversations and sympathetic glances. Mark, fueled by righteous anger and public humiliation, initiated divorce proceedings, his lawyers circling like vultures, determined to strip her of everything. Liam, battered by the collateral damage of the public spectacle, also found his world upended. His band, already teetering on the brink, fractured under the pressure, unable to withstand the negative publicity. Gigs were cancelled, his phone stopped ringing, and the vibrant artistic community that had once embraced him now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He tried to reach Eleanor, his calls and texts a desperate lifeline in the storm, but she, consumed by shame and a primal need to protect her children, retreated into an impenetrable shell. She knew he was hurting, that he was as much a victim of this public shaming as she was, but the weight of her own shattered life, the desperate need to salvage some semblance of normalcy for her family, made reaching out feel impossible. The silence between them, once a sign of cautious anticipation, now felt heavier than any shouted accusation. Weeks passed, blurring into a painful montage of legal meetings, tearful conversations with her children, and endless, solitary nights staring at the ceiling. One evening, driven by an unbearable sense of incompleteness, Eleanor found herself parked outside Liam's old apartment building. The lights were off, the windows dark, a stark symbol of the void that had opened in her life. She knew he had moved, left the city, desperate to escape the relentless scrutiny, but she needed to see it, to experience the finality of their separation. As she sat there, lost in thought, a figure emerged from the shadows of the alleyway beside the building. It was Liam, his shoulders slumped, a faded guitar case in his hand. He looked thinner, his eyes shadowed, but there was a stubborn resilience in his gaze, a quiet determination that still burned. Her heart leaped, a flicker of forgotten hope igniting in her chest. He didn't see her at first, his gaze fixed on the ground as he slowly walked towards a beat-up car parked down the street. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. What would she say? What could she possibly offer him now, when her own life was in ruins? But the pull was too strong, the need to speak her truth, to acknowledge the profound impact he had had on her, was overwhelming. She got out of her car, her legs feeling strangely heavy. Liam, she called out, her voice a little shaky, but clear in the quiet night. He froze, then slowly turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavy between them. He walked towards her, slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving hers. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I'd never see you again." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to remain composed. "I needed to tell you," she began, her voice gaining strength, "that I don't regret it. Any of it." The words, raw and honest, hung in the cold night air. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a melancholic curve that broke her heart. "Me neither," he replied, his voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, then gently cupped her cheek, his touch as electric as it had been that first night in the club. "You made me feel alive again, Eleanor. Really alive." They talked for hours, leaning against her car, the cold night air doing little to dampen the intensity of their conversation. They spoke of the pain, the anger, the public humiliation, but also of the profound connection they had shared, the brief, blazing fire that had consumed them both. Eleanor confessed her fear of losing her children, the desperate choices she had made in the wake of the scandal. Liam, in turn, acknowledged the selfish recklessness of their affair, the naive belief that their private world could withstand the onslaught of public judgment. There were no grand declarations, no promises of a future that felt impossibly distant. Just a raw, emotional confession of what they had meant to each other, a shared understanding of the wreckage they had created, and the profound, undeniable truth of their connection. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the deserted street, Liam finally pulled away, his hand lingering for a moment, then dropping to his side. "I have to go," he said, his voice thick with unspent emotion. "New start. Somewhere far away." Eleanor simply nodded, her throat tight, tears finally streaming down her face. There was nothing more to say, no plea that could change the inevitable. He turned, walked back to his car, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't look back. But just as he opened the driver's side door, he paused, his gaze sweeping over her one last time, a silent question lingering in his eyes. Eleanor met his gaze, her own filled with a mixture of heartbreak and a quiet, unyielding strength. She didn't offer a definitive answer, didn't give him the resolution he might have been seeking. Instead, she simply stood there, in the fading darkness, a solitary figure caught between the past and an uncertain future, leaving him, and herself, with the haunting, unresolved question of what might have been, and what, if anything, could ever truly mend the broken pieces of their lives.